Post-apocalypse. A short story by PJ Leonard. Part 2. When Horace came to, all he saw was black. At first, he wasn't even sure if he was awake at all. Am I dead? Am I blind? Then he reached out with his hands and felt his fingers touch cold metal. In a rush, it all came back to him. He balled his hands into fists and punched them against the door. It didn't budge, jammed into the frame. Twisting around, he planted his boots against the door, and with his back pressed against the opposite side, he pushed. The door buckled, and beams of blinding light spilled in. With a groan and then a loud snap, the hinges broke away and the door fell off. Horace held out his arm, shielding his eyes from the overpowering light. He clambered blindly from the box, limbs numb and shaking uncontrollably. He stepped out, and his stomach plunged when instead of hitting earth, he found only air. He tumbled out and fell, air whistling around him until his back hit something hard. The air burst out of Horace in a gasp. I hadn't been that high off of the ground, had I? Are you okay, mister? Horace looked up. A young girl stood over him. At least, he thought it was a girl. He could only see her silhouette against the sun. Horace groaned and clambered slowly to his feet. Every part of him ached, and he felt a splitting headache descending upon him. What happened? Horace croaked. You fell, the girl said simply. No, I mean, the meteor, did it hit? Horace tailed off when he properly looked at the girl. Her head was massive, at least twice as big as it should have been, and she had just one big eye. Horace gawped. The girl frowned, her single eye narrowing. What are you talking about, mister? She said. You fell out of the blast box. She pointed up, and Horace followed her finger. There, high above, planted on a thin pillar as rock as high as a house, was the metal collection box, the wall in which it had been embedded completely gone. It looked buckled and bent, with blooms of rust on the edges. What's it doing all the way up there? You really shouldn't be playing around here, mister, said the girl. That blast box is an important historical thingy. You're going to be in trouble for damaging it. She pointed with a long finger at a plaque on a pillar, embossed with writing. The blast box, one of the few surviving artifacts from the dark times. The height of this box gives us a good idea of how high the ground used to be. Legend says that there is intelligent life hiding within the box, waiting to be unleashed at the right moment. However, as this is an artifact from pre-meteor times, scholars are skeptical. What? Horace snapped. What does this mean? How? He wheeled around, but the girl was already gone, skipping away down the street. Horace staggered and nearly fell over as he looked around. The street was wide and impeccably clean, lined with low houses and bubble-shaped cars. He stared as a man as tall as the tallest basketball player strode out of a house. He had 2 eyes, but his head still looked inflated to twice the normal size. And did he have an extra finger on his hands? He climbed into a bubble car, and without so much as an engine rev, it silently floated into the sky and drove through the air. Horace watched it leave, heading towards what looked like the city centre. Ridgeworth had a small handful of high rises downtown, but this... It looked like the skyscrapers were literally scraping at the sky, great masses of towers and spikes looped by what looked like roads suspended in thin air. Horace could just about make out strange dots floating around the sky like insects, but as he watched the bubble car float towards the city, he realized that they were cars. Flying cars. Slowly, the truth descended on Horace like a cold cloud. This place. Could it be? Horace burst into a run. The roads had changed, but he knew straight away where he needed to go. He arrived, panting and sweating, at his house. At least, his house should have been there, but instead there was not a house, or even a road, but nothing. A plaque on a plinth stood where his front door should have been, on the edge of a vast, perfectly bowl-shaped valley. The trees clustered around the edges, and in the very bottom of the bowl, swaying peacefully in the blue shadows. Trembling, Horace approached and read the plinth. Meteor Horace, Impact Point. The valley before you is the indent caused by the meteor that struck here hundreds of years ago. It wiped out all of civilization for hundreds of miles around. However, the land recovered quickly, and Ridgeworth itself spearheaded that quick recovery. The origin and meaning of Horace is unknown, and is the subject of much debate among experts. Horace felt as though the ground beneath him had disappeared. The meteor really had happened, and somehow, not only had he survived, but he had woken up hundreds of years in the future. Exactly how long had it been? And Meteor Horace? They named it after him. Well, Horace would have been flattered if it weren't for the fact that they named a natural disaster after him, and they couldn't even remember what the name Horace came from. Well, Horace would have been flattered if it weren't for the fact that they named a natural disaster after him, and they couldn't even remember where the name Horace came from in the first place. It's probably for the best. I don't want to get the blame for wiping out humanity. The ring of a bell behind him made Horace jump, and he wheeled around. What looked like a giant tube had pulled up on the road beside his house. It was like a big version of those bubble cars. A circular door opened up like a camera shutter. "This is Horace Point," said the automated announcement. "This is a Ridgeworth shuttle service for Furnace's bus terminal." A bus! Horace had no idea where the Furnaces were, but bus terminals were usually in the city centre, weren't they? He had no idea what to do next, but the middle of the city seemed like a good place to start. He climbed into the bus and looked around. A couple more people were at the back, tall and bald-headed. He looked away before they got angry at him for staring too long. They probably think I look weird too, he reasoned. He was about to turn to the bus driver when he realized that there was no driver. "How do I pay?" "Please be seated," said the automated voice, and right on cue, a chair materialized out of the floor, shiny and liquid as though made out of molten steel. "Hurry up and sit down, mate," one of the people at the back of the bus shouted. "You're holding us up." Reluctantly, Horace sat down. To his surprise, it was cool and comfy. The door shut, and the bus lifted off of the ground and drove gently towards the mass of skyscrapers. The walls and roof of the bus were basically one big window, and Horace's neck ached as he tried to take in all of the strange sights. The twisted trees with bluish leaves, children's play parks with floating monkey bars, bubble cars zipping above and below him. I guess that this is my home now. The future didn't seem that bad. But then he thought of all of his co-workers at the mail centre. With a shiver, he realized that they'd all died hundreds of years ago. Everyone he'd known. Gone. Horace held his slightly burned postman's jacket tighter around him, feeling a chill. Something hard pressed against his chest, and he felt around in his pocket. It was the special delivery parcel. He'd completely forgotten about it. Wait a minute. He checked the date again. Note: please deliver by 11 a.m., May 10th, 28:45. He looked up at the panel display at the front of the bus. Next to the bus route information was the time and date. May 10th, 28:45, 9:42 a.m. Horace clutched the parcel tighter. The delivery deadline was in just over 1 hour. He'd woken up at just the right moment. There was no way that this was a coincidence, surely. 18 Campbell Road. Whoever lived there had to know something important that Horace needed to know. Besides, the post is a promise. It must get delivered no matter where or when, and always, always on time. No matter what. Even if it means surviving meteors, the end of civilization, and waiting hundreds of years. Horace rubbed his eyes. "I'd better get a raise out of this," he muttered to himself. When the bus lowered itself into Furness's bus terminal, he scrambled around for some coins to pay. Does this money even work anymore? But then he watched as the other passengers stepped off of the bus without so much as opening a wallet. Slowly, Horace followed them. He half expected some kind of loud alarm to buzz, yelling at him for not paying. But the door quietly shut behind him, and the bus floated silently away. If Horace thought the sight of the city at a distance was amazing, he nearly collapsed at the sight of the new Ridgeworth towering over him. Huge, looming skyscrapers of white and black leapt into the clouds, swirling with tiny flecks of flying cars. Roads weaved between the buildings in wide curves, and on the ground people jostled across the wide plaza and into the buildings. Elevators shot up and down the buildings faster than bullets, and some elevator shafts ran between buildings, arching through the sky like those water chutes at swimming pools. Horace had never felt so small, with everything feeling like it was leaning in over him. His foot slipped, and he looked down. Instantly, he knew why the bus terminal was called Furnaces. There was a huge crack in the ground, as wide as a river, but instead of being filled with water, it went deep underground. Lights from windows shone in the darkness, clouded by plumes of steam, reaching deep into the earth. And far below was a river. At least, it looked and flowed like a river, except it was bright green, glowing like neon in the dark. Horace was just about to step back from the precipice when a passerby hit him in the back with a shoulder. He stumbled forward, over the edge, and his foot hit an invisible floor. A pulse of electric rippled out from his boot like water. Carefully, he lifted his other foot and stood on what looked like thin air, the neon river far below. He tiptoed across, terrified he might fall through, but when he looked around, he saw the locals striding across without so much as looking down. A bell rang somewhere in the distance, and Horace looked up. A giant screen projected on the tower opposite read the time. 10 a.m. Horace shook himself. This is no time for tourism. I've got to get this delivery to 18 Campbell Road fast. He looked wildly around. Nothing in Ridgeworth seemed familiar. The roads on the ground were non-existent, all of the cars in the air. The memorized map of old Ridgeworth was useless. But there still had to be a Campbell Road. After all, it was addressed to this very date. He watched an elevator shaft fire an elevator up the side of a high tower. Maybe a view from up high will help me get my bearings. He crossed the plaza, pushing his way through the crowd. He felt like the shortest person alive. Everyone seemed to be a whole head taller than him, and he got a few curious glances from passers-by as he made his way to an elevator. It was a spacious elevator, but even though others were queuing, nobody else entered the elevator with him. Do I smell? Am I scaring people off or something? As the doors closed, an announcement declared, "Direct Rapid to Unity Square. Hold on to the rail, please." Unity Square? Where was... All thought was whipped out of Horace as he slammed to the floor. The elevator launched upwards so fast that Horace felt like he'd left all of his insides on the ground. As it slowed, Horace had a brief second to look over the mass of towers and flying cars glowing orange in the sunset, when he slammed sideways into the wall. The elevator blasted away from the building, flying like a rocket through the glass chute, past other skyscrapers, rushing by in blurs of white and black. Horace would have thrown up if he'd felt any control over himself. The elevator slowed quite suddenly as it neared the top of a rooftop. Of a tower, and Horace felt like his face was about to slide off. With a merry ding of a bell, the doors opened and Horace staggered onto the rooftop courtyard. "This is Unity Square," the elevator said. "Please mind your step." Horace slammed headfirst into the marble ground, the world spinning around him. Leaning on the trunk of a blue-leafed tree, he forced himself onto his feet and tried to walk forward. The edge of the tower swam into view, and he tried to steer himself away from it, but he was so dizzy that his legs carried him even closer. He grabbed a hold of the railing before he tumbled over the edge. Something slipped from his pocket. Horace's insides returned to him, now filled with ice, as he watched the parcel tumble over the edge and down the side of the tower. End of part 2.